Hello and welcome back to Audience, the podcast where you follow us as we build a podcast from scratch. Here we're really on a quest to find the best tactics and strategies to grow a podcast audience, literally from zero to tens of thousands of listeners each episode. Today I'm joined by fellow podcaster Srini Rao from the Unmistakeable Creative podcast. I really like the conversation I had with Srini here because he talks about a lot of his kind of reason for creating content and the way that he creates it, and a lot of the motivation behind the style he has with his content and where that's kind of driving his brand. I let Srini talk a lot more about this in the episode, but wanted to continue this thread of what constitutes really good content in our second interview here in the Audience podcast, because I think this is a real key driver of the organic growth side of your podcast. We'll experiment with a lot of different marketing tactics, paid and organic, but I think creating really good content is the cornerstone of a lot of what makes our content shareable and kind of go viral. So here to share more about kind of how he creates this kind of viral content that his audience obviously loves is Srini Rao. Would you mind kind of sharing with folks who aren't familiar with you and your show, kind of what you guys are all about?
Yeah, I think that, so it's funny because Simon Sinek once told me that my why is that I am obsessed with people who are good at unusual things. And I think that if you look at the guests on Unmistakable Creative, that's a pretty clear reflection of that. I mean, our guests have ranged from bank robbers to drug dealers to billionaires, all sort of with this theme of, unmistakable or something that they're, makes them very distinctive and interesting and fascinating. And I think the whole idea of creative is one of those things that I think we gave a very sort of broad definition to the word creative. And we did that on purpose because we wanted to make sure that, our focus was interesting people. And I think that the problem is, nowadays you see a lot of like early podcasters like, oh, I want to get these like famous internet celebrities on my podcast because they're going to make me like grow and, be really successful, but they don't. That's the furthest thing from the truth. I know this only because that was my thought process when we first started. And, I got a rude awakening pretty quickly that wasn't going to be the case. Yeah. So we ended up basically starting in 2009 as this podcast for bloggers, and it kind of evolved. And, today we have, we've had, I think, more than 700 guests. I think the best summary of what we do is what one of our listeners said. They said, if TED Talks met Oprah, you'd have the Unmistakable Creative, which is like as flattering as it gets in terms of a compliment. But, it was one of those things where we're like, yeah, that's great. I mean, you couldn't, it makes sense in a lot of ways, just based on the nature of the content.
And it sounds like this was kind of an organic growth of like what originally was podcast.fm and then into the Unmistakable Creative. Was that kind of an intentional evolution on your perspective or on your end, or was that something that was kind of grew?
No, it got more intentional as time went on. Yeah, I think it was one of those things where the more time we spent, like the more it became clear. Because I think that people have this idea when you start something, you're going to know exactly, how it's all going to go. You're going to have this like plan. And I mean, life doesn't go according to plan. So it was, largely accidental and organic. But I think what happened was with that sort of organic growth, we started to become a lot more intentional about how things were going.
Do you think that's a reasonable thing for other people who are just starting out to kind of follow that playbook, to say like kind of follow your heart, create something that you like, and then once it gets some traction, you can figure out, I'll say, what to do with it from there, like how to make it a business, how to make it a real brand after it's kind of successful?
Here's the thing, right? I think that if you go into it with this idea of, oh, I'm going to create something that is, based on what I think will get a lot of downloads or what I think will be popular, you're going to make decisions based entirely on numbers right from the start. Now, is that going to work? It might. I mean, I don't subscribe to that philosophy. It's never worked for me. I mean, I wrote an entire book about why that's a terrible idea. I think that if you go and look at the earliest creators, or the not even podcasters, but generally like some of the most successful creators in the world, hell, Oprah, right? One of the things that Oprah did was she refused to compromise on her values when, Donahue and some of these sort of crazy people were going up in the ratings, and she could have basically produced trash television. And instead, she decided to stick to her guns, and I think the results speak for themselves. I mean, she took a hit in the ratings in the short term. And so I think that's kind of one of the things, in the world we live in today, people don't have hobbies. Every hobby is a side hustle, and so when, you turn your hobby into a job, it kind of defeats the purpose of your hobby. And that's kind of a sad thing. So it's hard to say. I don't know that I have prescriptive advice for somebody who wants to start a podcast. I think that prescriptive advice is dangerous because the problem with all prescriptive advice is that it's formulaic. And the other problem with anything formulaic is there's one variable that throws off every formula for success, and that's the person who's applying the formula. So that's something to think about. So I think that you have to kind of go towards what you're naturally interested in, because there's going to be a period of time in which you're not going to see any traction and you're not going to see any results. So if like you're only doing this thing for some sort of external result, you're going to have a hard time staying motivated when you're not getting that result.
The dip, right? So I know you've had Seth Godin on your podcast before. That's what kind of comes to mind when you talk about this time where you're creating what you want for your own sake, and it might not be kind of resonating with your audience yet. And the stick-to-itiveness to stay with that path, to see it through to the other side of this dip is kind of where the people end up winning, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everybody starts with 0 listeners. Every writer starts with 0 readers. Every company starts with 0 customers. You know this from starting a company. So I think that, this sort of idea of I'm going to be, famous, or like I'm going to be the next Joe Rogan, I'm going to plug a microphone into a laptop and all that's, I don't think people see everything that comes before, like these moments in the spotlight.
So your book, An Audience of One, Reclaiming Creativity for Its Own Sake, is just over a year old. So August of last year, 2018. How did the book come about, and kind of how is it playing off what you're doing with a podcast?
So, the book and the podcast are kind of birds of a feather. The book came about because I got a 2-book deal with Penguin, and one of the, books was about this idea of writing 1,000 words a day. And, we started to look at it, and it just started to evolve more and more into a book about not just, writing, but a book about creativity in general. And so as a result, you end up with sort of this idea of the value of creativity for its own sake. So we're in this interesting world where you can go from idea to execution at record pace. The thing that brings also, though, is unrealistic expectations and impatience. So people think, I can start a podcast tomorrow. I can have everything up and running. I'm going to plug a microphone in. And by the end of the week, I'm going to have 1 million people listening to what I do. But that's not how this works. And so, the idea behind that book was really, hey, if you start with yourself, and it's kind of echoing what we just said, when we were talking about, how should people start? But basically, a lot of my ideas are often informed by my guests. A lot of my thought process, a lot of my writing is inspired by the people that I interview. In fact, so much so that I'm right now in the process of pitching a new book proposal, for a new idea that is as insane as but friends seem to have really kind of when I've told it to people, they get a good sort of, they're like, oh yeah, that sounds hilarious and amazing and entertaining. So, the new book idea is called This Might Not Work, What I've Learned from Field Testing the Life Advice from 700 Insanely Interesting People, as opposed to a book about sort of, because if you look at most books in this genre, right, what they focus on is distilling information. None of these books are about implementation or experimentation. They're all prescriptive, saying, hey, so the idea was not to give a prescriptive self-help book, but to write an experimental self-help book based on all these ideas. And, when you're sort of people that you're field testing advice from is bank robbers and drug dealers and the world's the New York's highest paid dominatrix, that leads to some potentially interesting ways to field test, what they've said.
Do you feel like getting too much input on like the creative process, or being around too many creative people, is a hindrance to you actually being creative and coming up with unique perspectives and ideas on things?
So no, not necessarily. This is the way I always describe it, right? Is you basically take different ingredients from different people and come up with your own recipes. The problem is that most people look at something that works and they're like, oh, well, X person did this. So, for example, this is an example that, we can use for the podcast world. It's like John Lee Dumas ended up starting, Entrepreneur on Fire. It's like, oh, it's a daily show. And, within a matter of months, he's crushing it, making a ton of money. And suddenly you see all of these sort of copycat shows pop up, all of which trying to do the exact same thing, following the format and, sounding exactly the same. I think that there is this sort of, idea that I'm just going to follow this person. Like, so here's what I think is that if imitation, they say is the highest form of flattery, but only in the short run. In the long run, it's just laziness. Yeah, you want to learn from somebody else, and the other thing is we're in a world full of noise. You do that, you're going to get washed up in, sort of a sea of sameness. And that's the thing. Like, I pull different ideas from different people. So I think that it's really about mixing all of them. So no, I don't think that being exposed to so many ideas actually prevents my creativity. In fact, I think back to the analogy that Robert Greene once gave me. He said, the analogy is biodiversity. The more species you have in an ecosystem, the richer that ecosystem. So like, if you think of my brain as the ecosystem and the people that I talk to as the species, then, the more creative it makes me.
Right. Yeah, no, I like to think about taking advice from a lot of different people and getting a bunch of different perspectives. And then you have to frame it in the lens that those people are coming from and their experiences and the things that they've done well and troubles they've had. And you take all of that with a bit of a grain of salt and know where someone is coming from to say like, okay, this advice they gave me or this thing they said said, makes sense for them in their context, but might not be kind of universally applicable. You mentioned John Lee Dumas, and there's several other people kind of in the online marketing world that do kind of similar things. And I think a lot of podcasters start out with something like that in mind.
Yeah.
Hey, I can, like you said, plug the mic into the computer, publish it on, iTunes, whatever, Apple Podcast, and get a bunch of downloads and sponsors the next month. Do you think that's why, like going into it with that mindset, do you think that's why people fail at podcasting at such a high rate? Or is there kind of something else to kind of why more people aren't successful with that kind of mindset?
Okay. So there are a couple of things here. I mean, this is like a very layered question, which, we could do an entire hour on just this question. So the thing that you have to realize is like, go look at stuff that started a year and a half ago, right? When everybody was like gung ho, you'll see the feeds haven't been updated in months. I only know because I have, podcasts that I've been on where that was the case, or podcasts where, friends had said that they do want to, even in my book launch, I had friends who had big audiences who were like, on hiatus from their podcast. And, many of them were like, oh, this is the last episode ever. And so that's one thing, right? Is attrition. That's an inevitable sort of byproduct. The other thing is consistency. So this is the example I always think of when, or I always kind of refer back to is you want your content to be a habit, not an interruption. So like, think about it this way, right? For whatever, 13 years or however long it was on the air, every Friday night or every Thursday night, we all got in front of our TV and we knew that NBC was going to have Friends on the air. Now, let's say that, that writers of Friends said, like, we're going to only write episodes when we feel like it. Well, they would have never built an audience, because how could an audience know that, hey, every Thursday night, this thing comes out? Now, how do you turn that into a habit? You'd produce consistently for years on end. I don't think that people really want to do the actual work of mastery, right? Because this is one of the things I said. I wrote this on Facebook the other day, which seemed to have really struck a chord with people. I said that, don't build a personal brand, develop rare and valuable skills. And if you go and look sort of at the NPRs, right? Like you look at the Shankar Vedantams of the world, or you look at Ira Glass, or you look at Alex Blumberg, you look at Sarah Koenig, all that stuff was like years and years and years and years in the making of people working in public radio, getting really good at what they did, learning from people who are better than them, and then basically launching, this stuff. Like, if you listen to the most recent episode of How I Built This, it's with Alex Blumberg talking about his first job working at This American Life for Ira Glass, where he was just like a intern or lackey or something. Like, he didn't really do anything glamorous. He wasn't Alex Blumberg. And, there's a lot of grunt work. I've always thought that early podcasters should edit their own episodes. I think it's a terrible idea for people to outsource their editing when they're starting out. And the reason I believe that is because I think that editing my own episodes was one of those things that made me a substantially better interviewer, because it forced me to go back and listen to every single thing I did multiple times. And I just kind of understood. The other thing is, like, if you don't understand how something is put together, it makes no sense for you to outsource it. And the reality is that you can't succeed in a noisy ecosystem by creating something that sounds the same as everything else. That's sort of hard. And so those are the things that I think about, right? So I think the reason people fail is, there are numerous reasons, but I think one of the big ones is that they're focused on metrics instead of mastery.
Well, that's a big one. Yeah, I can relate. I mean, as someone who runs a hosting and analytics platform, I think analytics is something that we have a lot of people are interested in, for sure. And the people who are the most interested in it have 30 downloads an episode, which is really interesting, because those are the people that should just be out there doing more of it.
Exactly. So this is the paradox, right? I mean, I don't think I very rarely look at my analytics on your website. It's one of those things where I'm like, all right, you know what? I'm busy producing content. It's this whole stupid idea that refreshing your analytics is going to make them go up. It's like, no, what makes your, analytics go up is creating something worth listening to. But that's a lot harder.
Yeah. I mean, that's an even, I mean, like you said, this is a whole nother kind of discussion, but I mean, for folks who are really just starting out, I think that one of the really intimidating things about creating any kind of content, and podcasting maybe in particular, because there's a limited amount of feedback you can get, or limited ways that you can get feedback from podcasting, because like we talk and people listen, and there's not like this discussion. It's not a Facebook group or something like that. Yeah. What are some things you might recommend to people who are just starting out to say, like, okay, stick with your guns, create the content you want, and like the people will come in the end. That's kind of what I'm getting from you, is like, if the content is that good, it will all work out in the end. Is there any more kind of like specifics you would guide people to on that?
Okay, well, so there are a lot of things that I think would be insane for me to tell you to reverse engineer, because there are a lot of factors here that nobody wants to admit play a role. Like luck played a role in me getting to this point. Like I started in 2009. Like this is one of the reasons I'm like reluctant to teach a podcasting course, because what am I going to say? Hey, get yourself a DeLorean, go back in time and start in 2009. Like that's not feasible. It's like, okay, I can't help you reverse engineer that. Or, hey, hope that Glenn Beck finds your book on Amazon when he's, perusing it one day. Like these are all sort of weird inflection points. And so for me, like the only parts of this that I can actually reverse engineer are the process parts. So as far as feedback goes, this is a complicated one. Because you're right. Like, how do you get feedback when you have nobody listening? I was really lucky in that I got some positive reinforcement early on from a very small group of people. I think of Chris Guillebeau had this sort of idea of what he called the small army strategy. I even wrote a book about this called the small army strategy, which I think is more relevant today now when you're competing for so much attention than it was when I wrote this book. So the idea was that, if you have 5 people in your audience, you treat them like the most important people in the world, because they are. Like they're the ones who are choosing to listen to you. And with a podcast, you may not have their email addresses, whatever it is. So you go and you ask friends, you ask family, you ask anybody who will give you feedback to listen. It's that joke of, hey, your first reader on your blog is your mom. And, it's funny. I think my mom to this day still reads my stuff, but yeah, it's your earliest readers are anybody who will talk to you. So that I think that the idea that this is another one of those things, right, is you don't start building an audience by interrupting strangers on the internet. Like that's not how an audience gets built. My earliest sort of blog readers were my family members, people that went to Pepperdine, some classmates of mine from Berkeley, my study abroad coordinator from Pepperdine, and that's it. Like 5 or 6 people who used to read this stuff. There's a guy who hired me he was my first freelance client. He hired me for $50 to come in and teach him a few things I knew about public speaking and social media, which I didn't know much at that point. So I think it's, what I would say is, okay, if you do have anybody there, treat them like the most important people in the world, and then go out and actively seek feedback. I mean, one of the big pieces of feedback that led me to start the podcast was from my friend Sid Savaro, who said, he's like, you're a much better interviewer than you are a writer. And I think you'd be more successful if you actually took this interview series and spun it out into a separate site. So, I think that there's that whole thing, right? I wish I could tell you that there's like some sort of formula. And the thing is, the formula is super seductive, and there are tons of people who will sell it. Just go look at the sales pages for any podcasting course. It's like, here's my, 6-step formula and how I'm going to tell you how to set this up, and of course this is one of those things that I think is something people need to consider, right? There's all these people sort of saying, oh, everybody should start a podcast. Well, yeah, okay. If somebody who has a course on podcasts is saying everybody should start a podcast, then maybe you should consider context there. It's kind of like those people who say, oh, everybody should be on this app. And it's like, well, of course you think everybody should be on the app. You have a massive equity stake in that company, So I think that it's important to consider those kinds of things. And if anybody is looking for a shortcut, then they shouldn't start at all. That's my advice. To sum it up pretty simply, there are no shortcuts to this.
You guys crossed a pretty big chasm recently to receive some funding for your podcast, talking about like different ways that people can monetize their podcasts, sponsorships or whatever. You guys received some funding from PodFund to just create more awesome content, right?
Well, I mean, not just to create more awesome content, and this is one of those things that I think that I remember the day that PodFund announced the fund, because I was watching, what was happening in the Facebook group for podcasters, and the conversations were kind of insane because people were just talking about what they would do with the money. And the problem is with that, it's like, oh, well, if you don't know what you would do with the money, nobody's going to invest money in you. Like I'd been really lucky in that I interviewed a lot of venture capitalists. We ran it as a business, and, it had its challenges even running it as a business. So I understood that if you were going to get funded, you had to make a business case. It wasn't just going to be, hey, create awesome content and we'll give you money. It was like, how are you going to generate money and how are you going to produce a return? So, I understood this from having worked, like I said, having had mentors who have invested in companies, having talked to literally every sort of, person under the sun on the podcast itself, many of who are investors. And I had an idea of what these people look for in terms of a pitch deck. Like I went in with a pitch deck and said, okay, this is what we project as our financials. These are our financials before. These are the ways that we envision making money. And these are the things that we will use the funding for. And this is our team. And, I treated it like I was going to apply at Y Combinator for funding from a VC, not, people are funding your personal art project. So not, as much as I wish they were like, here's some money to create awesome content. No, it's here's some money. How are you going to return it multiple times over?
Yeah. Has taking the investment from PodFund changed how you run the business?
Yeah, absolutely. In good ways. And in a lot of good ways. One, it holds us accountable to a whole other standard. But the other thing, the big thing, the reason we took the funding was because it allows us to stop thinking short term. It allowed us to basically have a much more long-term perspective and think through initiatives. Because, I was just finished reading Simon Sinek's new book, The Infinite Game. And, when you're struggling to survive month to month, you're like, oh, if we're going to run out of cash, that makes it hard to have a long-term perspective and think strategically. So you just kind of do whatever you can to get cash in the door. You take any advertiser who will pay you money. And there were a lot of initiatives we couldn't pursue because we just didn't have the funding. So recently we hired a community manager, because we grew very organically, almost entirely through word of mouth. And we thought, it's time we activate this word of mouth component, because if we do this right, we saw what, the Hustle and the Skim and all those folks had done with their word of mouth component. And so, yeah, we basically, hired a community manager as one of our listeners who's been amazing. And we're building an entire network on Mighty Networks, like a private social network specifically for our listeners, mainly because we want to get the hell off of Facebook, because, we want to be somewhere where we don't have to pay to play and people actually see our damn content.
That's another episode. But yeah, I think communities around your podcast is by far the most powerful kind of avenue people can take to continue the discussion.
Well, not only that, one of the things that we want is we want to get to a point where we can generate subscription revenue from the community. Because you think about it, right? Even the biggest media companies in the world, like the New York Times, are, looking at advertising and saying, okay, you know what? We don't want to be dependent on advertisers, entirely. And the biggest issue with advertisers in general, when you look at it from like the New York Times or, standpoint, or even, mainstream media, is that it's very hard to have, you can't have truly objective journalism when there's advertiser interest involved. And, for me, and this is something I've held to, and, we paid for it in terms of metrics, is that I said, I will never compromise the editorial in order to hit the numbers.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think that the growth of your podcast and the success is a reflection of that, right? You tell interesting stories, have compelling content, and that drives the success of the podcast, which then allows you to do interesting things with monetization and subscriptions and sell advertising spots, but not the other way around.
Yeah, exactly.
We took a small amount of investment earlier this year as well, and I absolutely agree on the long-term thinking aspect of what you're talking about. And now we think in terms of years and not weeks or months, which is really nice. And I think we're making much better decisions for our customers and like the long-term life of the business. So it's been a positive thing for us.
Very cool.
Yeah. Without kind of giving away the secret sauce, what is kind of the general plan for your show in terms of subscriptions and selling subscriptions?
I think that the thing with subscriptions, right, is that, so let's say that you are selling subscriptions. I think there's this idea that, you're going to basically go and, it's like, oh, I'm just going to put a bunch of people in here and they're just going to pay for, whatever your goodwill is. Like, one thing we realized was that community manager position was like, this is a job. Like, somebody needs to do it and somebody needs to own it. It is a straight up like OKR. It has to be, because I've seen how much work is going into it. There's no way that it can be like, oh, I'm, the host of the podcast and I'll just do this thing on the side of it. It doesn't work like that. Like, you will not succeed like that. I saw it, like anything else, it's strategic. It involves, really thinking through and having a plan. The other thing is, what is the value that you're providing to people inside of the community? Like, so Tim Ferriss's, no sponsors experiment was a failure, but then you go and look at what people got, and I'm sure he probably made money off of it, but because he's Tim Ferriss. But then you looked at it and you're like, okay, well, there's not a lot here that's, really worth whatever he was, asking for. And so anyways, yeah, that's the gist of it. It's, it's still in the works, to be honest. So, part of it is like we're looking at the possibility of taking all of our online courses and moving them into that, to the point where it's like, okay, you don't just get, the community, but everything we create from this point forward as a course, you not only end up supporting the podcast, but then you also get all our courses too.
Interesting. Kind of generally from a content and kind of strategy perspective, looking forward with the funding and different monetization things you have kind of going on, what is the future for the Unmistakable Creative look like for the next year or two?
Well, I think right now it's increasing the size of the audience and hence increasing ad revenue, but alongside that also building this community aspect of it, really kind of pushing. I think that we want to get our listeners to the point where but I would like our listeners to be our most effective source of marketing, not advertising. In terms of growth, because if they do their job, and the thing is, it's not like we're like holding a gun to their head and saying, hey, hey, you've got to spread the word. But they've always been our biggest advocates. It's these people are the ones that really make things happen for us. And so we knew, we're like, okay, if we start this program, it's going to take some time to build, but if we do it right, it could be really valuable and have a pretty substantial payoff. And so, I think that's one of those things. And we, like I said, we hired a community manager who was really working hard to basically learn, everything she needs to about how to properly build a community. And it's funny because she's like not even a social media person. She's a civil engineer. So that's, one focus of it. We're planning a conference that's coming, that's in April of this coming year. It's called the Architects of Reality. And you can find out about it at thearchitectsofreality.com, where we're bringing, former podcasts together to speak at the event and inviting our listeners. And then, another thing that we're doing is we're playing with a new format of the show, which is more of an NPR style approach of, instead of taking, a person, let's focus on an idea. And we just released the very first one, this week, or last week. Is called The Life-Changing Magic of Meeting People in Person. This one was kind of a shameless plug for the event, but we also wanted to see, it's like, okay, let us show you that we can do a hell of a lot more than do interviews. And I remember the feedback from a couple of our friends was like, wow, this sounds like Radio Lab in This American Life. I'm like, great. That's a great
awesome
compliment,
Yeah. It's gutsy to change the format of a podcast with how many episodes? Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds.
Yeah. Well, we're not going to abandon the interviews. We just wanted to introduce a new format because I think that, we want, 50 Cent and Robert Greene wrote a book together called The 50th Law. And one of the things they talk about is the need to continually reinvent yourself. You don't want to be a one-trick pony. And to us, we've always had other capabilities up our sleeves. And we're like, okay, well, let's show people what we can do and show them we can do far more than, an interview. Like we've got all these really interesting things we can do. And, the thing is that, for the person who doesn't want to listen to an interview, that opens up a whole other audience for us.
Yep. I love it. Last question. You mentioned the tool that you're using to kind of base your kind of internal private network or social media network on. Can you share more about kind of how you made that decision? And, obviously the why to get off Facebook is clear, but.
No. So we made that decision because of a podcast guest who told us. It was Cal Newport, who had talked about this sort of, what he called long tail social media. And he wrote a lengthy blog post about it. But he did this thing where he dropped it, and said, hey, like the neat thing about this is that it's social media that allows you to meet people, from your community in person because you can see who's nearby to you. And one of the things they encourage you is, don't post here more than like twice a week, which is funny because it's the polar opposite of Facebook, which is like, create as much content as possible. It's funny because Ryan Holiday the other day was just telling me, he's like, people wonder why they're not productive, but they're working for Twitter for free for 6 hours a day by tweeting constantly, and people do the same thing with Facebook. And so, Cal told us about it, and we knew that if we had a community, if we were going to launch this ambassador program, we needed a tool, and it kind of fit the bill for all of them. It kind of was like, oh, we can launch the ambassador program, have a community component, and run this network in here. And so that's where we're at. And we just launched the ambassador program about a week ago, or actually this week.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah,
we'll definitely link to that in the show notes for this episode. Srini, for anybody who kind of wants to learn more about the ambassador program or what you guys are doing with the show, where's the best place to connect?
So you can go to unmistakablecreative.com. And then I think if I remember correctly for the ambassador program, it's unmistakablecreative.com/tribe.
Hope you enjoyed that interview with Srini Rao from the Unmistakable Creative. I really like what Srini is doing with the brand and creating content for himself and for his brand. And as a result, it's clear that the audience size is growing and listeners are coming in droves. As a result, they're doing things like raising funding for their podcast to make their podcast into a real business, which is, I think, a lot of the goals for a lot of us is to build an asset and a tool for our business or make it a business in and of itself. And Srini has certainly given us kind of a roadmap of how to get from just starting, even though he started years ago now, to building something that's really sustainable and a real asset to his brand. So I think this is a really good example of what this can be for all of us. And I hope everybody enjoyed. We'll be back again in the next episode with an update on some of our analytics, our listenership as it's growing here in the first handful of episodes. And then we'll be getting into our marketing plans for how we're going to be growing both organically and in a paid way with the Audience Podcast. Questions or comments for this episode are certainly welcome. Please go to castos.com/podcast to leave a comment for this episode. And if you haven't, please share this podcast with someone who you think would enjoy it as well. So new or existing podcasters who are looking to up their game and grow their audience, share the Audience Podcast with them. We would really appreciate it. And on kind of a personal note, Happy New Year to everyone. This episode will be going out on Thursday, January 2nd. So here, a fresh start to the new year. I hope everybody had a great holiday season and is rested and ready to go with their podcasts here in the new year. 2020 promises to be an extraordinary year, I think, for all of us. So Happy New Year to everybody and happy podcasting. We'll see you next time.